All right, let's take a look at these 6 terms: voltage, current, resistance, power, energy, and time. Knowing and understanding these 6, the symbols that we use to describe them, and the units that we use to measure them are going to help us move forward when it comes time to looking at different formulas or formulae to try to solve for current, or looking at trying to figure out what the power is in the circuit. So let's start with voltage. What voltage is really all about? We describe it as this electric potential. It's the potential that sort of pushes electrons through a conductor. And you played around with this with static electricity. We were playing actually, by charging neutral objects through friction. We were basically creating this electric potential. That's the reason why you'd end up having, shocks being seen, is that it's the movement of those electrons from the negatively charged object to the positively charged object. And the reason why they'd even want to do that is because you've set up this potential. You set up a positively charged object and you set up a negatively charged object. And when allowed to, if those electrons can conduct themselves from one to the other, they will do so. And as a result, you had this shock. And that is all because of voltage. All right, so voltage is that potential energy behind that pushes current or pushes electron through a conductor. Now, current, you can see then, is very similar because it is very related to voltage. When we do start to see electrons moving through a conductor, well, we call that current. So you can kind of see, without voltage, we don't have current. They're 2 different terms, but they are very connected. The other one is resistance. Resistance is the amount of sort of pushback, or when electricity is converted into other forms of energy, it sort of uses up or takes away that electric potential, that energy behind that electron flow. And when it does that, we call that resistance. And that is another important thing, because that sort of reduces or impacts current flow. Resistance will slow down or sort of use up that energy that we see behind that electron flow. All right. Now, power is really all about the usage of energy, or the rate that we use energy as we convert that electrical energy into another form of energy. So as we start to get this going, the whole point behind this is that we want to create circuits, and we create circuits with the intent to sort of make devices or mechanisms that sort of benefit us. If we want to create light, we would create a circuit using these 3 concepts. And when we start to create light through let's say a light bulb, we can then start to rate that, and we can start to measure that. And how we measure that is power, because it's the rate at which we sort of use this energy at a specific rate. Now, that brings us to our next term. Well, what's energy? Well, energy is the potential to do work, and that's another important thing behind all of this. Is that's the reason why we have circuits. We've found a way to harness electrical energy so that it can provide us some useful benefits, such as light. We can, a motor. We can create heat, and that is using energy and understanding that that is the ability to do work. Finally, the last one is time. Now, time, for what we're going to be doing here, and it's going to have specific units that we need to sort of calculate for, but really time is just understanding that when we use energy over a specific rate or a specific sort of segment of time, we can measure that. If we use a certain amount of energy over an hour, or a certain amount of power over a minute, we can rate that, we can measure that, and that becomes another important way for us to sort of describe how we are using electrical energy. All right, so let's get back to the units that we see for these 6 different terms. But before we do that, let's take a look at voltage here. Voltage, you might often see written down in shorthand as V, which is handy because it kind of makes sense. Current, not as obvious. We will use the shorthand sort of symbol capital I to represent current. Resistance, we can use a capital R to represent resistance. When it comes to power, again, nice and handy, pretty easy to guess. P represents power. And, hang on. And what we end up doing for this is energy, handy again, we use capital E to represent energy. And when it comes to time, we will often represent time as T. In some of the formulas, you'll see it written down as a lowercase t. But time, there it is. All right, so let's go back up to the top here to voltage. What is voltage measured in? Well, voltage is measured in units called volts. And we represent that with, again, a capital V. That's very handy. But the units that we use are called, are volts. When it comes to current, we use something called amps, represented here with a capital A. And what amps really stands for is amperes, or amps. Resistance is measured in something called ohms. And this symbol is kind of interesting. It looks kind of like an upside down U. It's called an omega sign. And we use the unit ohms to describe or to measure resistance in a circuit. Power is measured in something called watts. And we write this down as W-A-T-T-S, watts, or a watt. And energy is measured in something called joules, or capital J, and be careful with the spelling of this, J-O-U-L-E, a joule, or if it's plural, joules. And finally, we have time. Time can be measured in different units. Pay particular attention to how or what formula you're using when it comes to using time. The one that we'll be using when it comes to calculating power is we will measure it in seconds. But you're going to see in other applications where time is measured in other units, such as hours or minutes. But for the equation that we're going to be using it for in grade 9 electricity for calculating power, it's going to be measured in seconds. All right, so there it is. Those are the 6 sort of units, the concepts that you need to keep in mind when we go ahead with electricity and we start to solve equations. We'll be using variations or different combinations of these 6 concepts here.